Ian Masters is a BBC-trained broadcast journalist who's covered national security affairs for over 25 years on public radio. He's the host of Background Briefing and Live from the Left Coast on KPFK, which is heard Sundays from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Ian's produced documentaries for ABC News and Frontline and edited a number of features and documentaries, including Koyaanisqatsi and The Secret Life of Plants. He's been a senior fellow at UCLA's Center for Strategic and International Affairs and UCLA Center for International Relations, and was a consultant to the Center for National Security Studies at Los Alamos Laboratories in New Mexico. Please join me in welcoming Ian Masters.
Thank you, Claudia. Tonight we will discuss rumors of war with Iran, an attempt to separate war plans from determined military resolve, bluster from psyops, and covert actions from neocon fantasies, as well as the carrot from the stick, all in the context of the dying days of a moribund Bush presidency, which has managed to turn Teddy Roosevelt's dictum of talking softly and carrying a big stick on its head by talking stickly and carrying a big soft. As our economy crashes into the void of Wall Street's dark markets, with $62 trillion of credit default swaps hidden from daylight and tethered to God knows what, while we wait for other shoes to drop and a possible cascading of further collapses, we might have to consider that we won't have the luxury of discussing our foreign policy in the future, if indeed we have one. A foreign policy, that is. It's beginning to look like the empire has bankrupted the republic, and there'll be no more bringing it on and smoking them out dead or alive, because the lone superpower will not be able to stand tall in the saddle on Chinese credit for much longer. We'll hear from both of our guests for about 15 minutes each, then we'll have a discussion on stage, and then we'll open up for Q&A with you, the audience. I'm hoping tonight we can get a sense of what our options are in Iran, not that we are exploring the obvious one, diplomacy, and perhaps Dr. Parsi can tell us what exactly is going on in Iran with their apparent determination to enrich uranium, which means sometime soon they'll cross a red line that Israel has drawn to use nuclear weapons if necessary to prevent Iran from making nuclear weapons and wiping them off the map. Why should we care? Well, there has not been a nuclear shot fired in anger since Nagasaki, and crossing the threshold to usable nuclear weapons, of which there are thousands in tactical battlefield arsenals, which will erase the deterrent value of the ultimate weapon and make nuclear war acceptable. Furthermore, unless there is a nuclear-free zone imposed in the Middle East, which is highly unlikely, nuclear weapons will proliferate in the region, with Saudi Arabia buying some from Pakistan, if they haven't already, not to mention a fire sale of Pakistan's nukes, if and when that all but failed state falls apart. Who runs Iran? What are the chances of reform from within as opposed to regime change from without? Although I can't imagine anyone inside Iran wants to be liberated by us if Operation Iraqi Freedom is the model. Indeed, I expect the mullahs wake up every morning and thank the great Satan for removing Saddam on one side and the Taliban on the other. So much for Bush's strategic vision. But as bad as Bush is in terms of foreign policy, indications are that McCain will be worse and President Palin off the charts. We know this because of what just happened in Georgia, a little wag-the-dog war the neocons ginned up to help McCain that has hurt America as much, if not more, than Iraq. John McCain's national security advisor, Randy Scheuneman, the go-to guy in Washington for the infamous conman, embezzler, and double agent Ahmed Chalabi, is also a paid lobbyist for the Georgian government. Scheuneman convinced his client, Georgia's President Misha Saakashvili, that to get things done in Washington, you only deal with the vice president and the neocons. Forget Department of Defense, CIA, and state. So while Condi Rice was on a vacation with a do not disturb sign on her door, and Bush was patting the backsides of beach volleyball players in Beijing, they goaded little Georgia into attacking big Russia using the Olympics as a cover. McCain's man in Tbilisi, like Chalabi, is a fraud and a fool, and he walked into Putin's sucker punch. The Georgians were routed, and their Israeli-trained special forces bolted as an unstable Saakashvili was issuing impetuous orders over an open cell phone. Later, facing humiliation, he put a gun to his head only to be saved by a bodyguard. The significance of this reckless fiasco concerns BP's oil pipeline through Georgia, one of the few hedges against our total dependence on Middle East oil that has become increasingly vulnerable and expensive since Bush blundered into Iraq. Now Putin, whose graduate thesis at the St. Petersburg Mining Institute was on how the Soviet Union could exercise leverage over the West by controlling oil and gas pipelines from the Caspian, effectively controls the spigot on that alternative to Middle East oil. Furthermore, Israel, who was arming and training the Georgian military, Georgia's Minister of Defense and Minister of Territorial Integrity are both Israeli citizens, now finds itself unable to secretly use the Georgian air bases it was preparing for an attack on Iran. Whatever you think about the wisdom of bombing Iran, and no senior military or intelligence officer thinks it's a good idea, the neocons have blown their own plans, continuing their reckless utopian tradition of strategic blindness and breathtaking tactical incompetence. In conclusion, Iran and Russia are the winners, and they're likely to get closer. Putin recently called up Shimon Peres and threatened to sell arms to Syria and Iran if Israel didn't stop arming Georgia. However, I understand Russia is secretly arming Iran through Moldova and its no man's land, Transnistria, which I'm sure Mr. Baer will talk about. So let's begin with Robert Baer, who spent 20 years running agents from inside CIA's Director of Operations from 1976 to 1997, working against Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, and other terrorist organizations. He is considered by Seymour Hersh, who has been writing about a possible war with Iran for some time, as perhaps the best on-the-ground field officer in the Middle East. Robert Baer is the author of 2 New York Times bestsellers, Sleeping with the Devil, How Washington Sold Our Soul for Saudi Crude, and See No Evil, which was the basis of the film Syriana, which earned George Clooney an Oscar for his portrayal of Mr. Baer. Robert Baer writes regularly for Time.com and has contributed to Vanity Fair, The Wall Street Journal, and The Washington Post. He is considered one of the world's foremost authorities on the Middle East. His new book, just out and available later in the museum bookstore upstairs for signing, is The Devil We Know, Dealing with the New Iranian Superpower. Ladies and gentlemen, Robert Baer.
Thank you very much for inviting me back again. I was here about 6 months ago, again talking about Iran and the Middle East. My view is a bit peculiar because it's from living in the Middle East for 21 years as an American. My terms of reference are sometimes I don't share in common with most Americans. And my history with Iran goes back to a very specific event, and that was the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut in April 1983. It was probably the most devastating attack on the American Foreign Service in its history. It was the most devastating attack. On that day, it was 18 April, a pickup truck drove through the front lobby, exploded halfway up the steps. The force of the explosion was so heavy that it forced the plexiglass into the Marine, and they didn't find a piece of his body. It was incinerated. What we found was that the world changed. For me, for the CIA, there were 6 CIA officers lost there, all of whom I knew. I was in Beirut in December and January, just a couple months before. And Bob Ames, national head of intelligence for the Middle East, was killed in this explosion. It's all of a sudden, for us, it was, I'll use the cliche, it was a wake-up call, because it was no longer Palestinian terrorism. It was Shia terrorism in this case. It was Iranian terrorism, as we found out. But more than that was the effectiveness of the attack. In October 23rd, we're coming up on an anniversary, a suicide bomber drove in to the Marine barracks, Beirut Airport, kill, 241 Marines and soldiers. Another attack. This was a defeat, little understood in this country because we have generically covered it with the word terrorism, which is just completely misleading. Terrorism had nothing to do with it. That was a military operation which resulted in Reagan pulling back the Marines onto boats and leaving Lebanon, just basically giving up. There has not been an incident in American history where we've been forced out of a country where we had vital interests in two attacks where the enemy lost 2 people. Not only with that, it was the precision of these attacks from an insider. It's very difficult to set off a car bomb reliably 100%, but to set them off so they get inside of a building and bring the building down. On top of it, we were faced with the fact that we didn't know who the bomber was, the Marine Corps barracks, nor the embassy. We had suspicions, but they've never come out and said who they are. Suddenly, the war changed. We weren't the only ones to miss it, because on the 11th of November, 1982, the Israeli military headquarters in the south was blown up. Again, a suicide bomber drives through the front door, kills 70-some Israelis and Arab prisoners that were being held in the building. We and the Israelis tended to dismiss this as a phenomenon unrelated to the course of history, that we were going to get over this. We were going to defeat a couple dead-enders, if you want them. We were going to go back to dealing with the Palestinian problem. It was going to be very easy. What we missed was a new form of asymmetrical warfare, which gets to the point of the title, the subtitle of my book about Iran, the superpower. We take this 18-year war, and for the first time in Israel's history, it was forced to give up territory under fire. 18 years, the Israelis could make no headway against the Iranian-backed resistance, the Islamic resistance. It was proficient. They were using advanced weapons combined with things like mobbing tactics, where, the 20 or 30 people dressed as farmers, as merchants, donkey carts, would hit an Israeli patrol from all sides and overcome heavy armor. It's not going to do any good for us to describe what happened in Lebanon other than accurately. And the Israelis were beat. And this was an Iranian, organized, developed army, and it was very specific. The other thing we've missed in Lebanon and the rest of the world is the extraordinary discipline of Iranians. They went to war against the Israelis with a direct objective, with very little money, and with an incredible absence of corruption in this war. Total absence of corruption, which is unprecedented in the Middle East. None of that money that went into Lebanon, into the military effort, was stolen. It went to the right places. The Israelis in 2000, when they decided to leave Lebanon, described this as a political defeat. They lost the political will. Once the Shia in the south got Lebanon back, they could restore the border, they could negotiate. And then we got the 2006 war, 34-day war. The Israelis were defeated, and this is something they admit. For the first time, Israeli deterrence since 1948 was overcome. They lost that deterrence power. What surprised the Israelis on top of that was that they managed to take out a corvette with a modified Silkworm. That's a boat, very sophisticated, well-trained crew, completely surprised the Israelis. I think killed 4 sailors. Hezbollah managed to blanket out Israeli radar in all the cities. All cities in Israel are still vulnerable by these rockets. And moreover, for somebody who studied communications for years, was absolutely amazing that Hezbollah has gone to fiber optics. That means the Israelis can't intercept them, and it's absolutely crucial. And as long as I'm giving you a laundry list of where this war has gone, As we know, the Hezbollah moved into caves, completely negating the Israeli Air Force, negating predators, these remote-controlled surveillance aircraft, and Israelis were stunned. In the Winograd Commission, they came out and said, we've lost our deterrence capability. We cannot let this go. Now, what this has left us with is Israel, and I'm not advocating anything. I'm just describing a situation as I would in a briefing. Israel has to get this deterrence capability back. It has to get a strategic upper end, the upside of this. Because if they don't, they're going to lose to Iran. Today, it's my feeling that the Israelis put this conflict in terms of the nuclear weapon. But what they're really concerned about is Iran's overarching strategy, conventional power, asymmetrical warfare, and this fiasco that Iraq was. The neocons have said, don't worry about Iraq because the Arabs are Semites and they'll never, ever in the long run work with the Iranians who are Indo-Europeans. It'll never happen in history. And they'll go back and cite events, going back thousands of years. The Arabs are Bedouin and the Persians live in cities and they're more sophisticated and it'll never happen. This is one of the dumbest arguments I've ever heard. Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, is an Arab. Not a drop of Persian blood in him. Not only that, he's completely sophisticated. And not only that, he has put his fate in Iran's hand. Thirdly, having defeated Israel, he is the new Salahuddin of the Middle East. We're looking from an Arab Islamic point of view. We're looking from a social class that has been oppressed locally. We're looking at people that are pro-Palestinian. We're looking at the Iranians who are not particularly pro-Palestinian, but they've managed to turn the Palestinian issue into a banner of anti-colonialism. Which leaves us the United States, and we're heading toward a dilemma here because if we take this attack on the Corvette in 2006, can you imagine what these Silkworm missiles, which these batteries are buried along the Persian Gulf? You notice I use the Persian Gulf for a reason rather than the Gulf. They can take out tankers. I mean, call up Lloyd's and ask them, 3 tankers get hit, insurance is pulled, 17 million barrels of traded oil is taken off world markets. The Iranians can target Abqaiq, which produces that's an oil facility in Saudi Arabia, the major one. They can target that. They can take it out with a couple of missiles. We effectively, if we go to war in the Persian Gulf, we lose 55 to 65% of world reserves of oil. We're addicted to oil. I think this administration would have hit Iran if it weren't for oil. It was certainly proposed by Olmert, the prime minister. It was certainly considered by Cheney. Seymour Hersh's stories on this were absolutely accurate, but someone woke up and said, wait a minute, Iran is a superpower. In other words, we're going to go into World War III. Maybe an economic one, they may be blackmailing us, but it is World War III. The important thing is the Iranians are not going to do this preemptively, take out the oil. They could have done it years ago. They could have done it in 2001, done the most damage. They are interested in survival. Iran is no longer that country that bombed the Marines. It's no longer the country that bombed the embassy. They've arrived, if you like. Iraq, let me go back to Iraq. It's very important. The reason the surge is working is thanks to Iran. Iran does not want a civil war in Iraq. It can't afford it, because if Sunni fundamentalism ever picks up a base in Iraq, it will slop across the border into Iran. They want the same thing for Afghanistan. They don't want the Taliban back. I don't know if for those who read the Iranian press, they were apoplectic, the Iranians, yesterday when Gates was talking about reconciling with the Taliban. And he was saying, what's next? Is Mullah Omar going to be at the White House? drinking orange juice. So the Iranians have won in Lebanon. They have Syria under their thumb because it's an Alawite regime, which, and I apologize for any Alawites here if there are any, they're not really considered Muslims by Shia and Sunni. So they need a protector, and that's Iran. Iran that has beat the Israelis. And you add Iraq, who needs the Iranians to keep the peace, to keep Muqtada Sadr from killing Sistani and so forth. They need Iran to bring the same discipline that they brought to Hezbollah. And Iran has made it known to the Iraqis that this is going to be a benign alliance. You're not going to see Iranian troops in Iraq. You're not going to see them coming across the border. You're going to see a relationship I liken to the United States and Canada, where they do not want Iraq being set up for a hostile base. They don't want the United States out today. They don't want the United States to leave like we did in Vietnam. They want them out in a couple of years and slowly. Which brings me to the point. I mean, Iran in control of the Persian Gulf, not occupation, but Iran in control of the Persian Gulf makes them a superpower. The big question is, and this is not a firm prediction, if you're in Israel and these dominoes start to fall, and these aren't dominoes like Southeast Asia, communist dominoes, these are true dominoes that include the Palestinians and the rest of it, put yourself in the position of the Israelis. Do they turn the table over, or do they let Iran become strategically and for the long term predominant? I used to work for the CIA. I do pessimism. They'll probably attack, take out the nuclear facilities, knock Iran down, try to get their deterrence factor back. Thank you for that good news.
Thank you, Bob. Dr. Trita Parsi is the author of Treacherous Alliance, The Secret Dealings of Iran, Israel, and the United States, which will be available later in the museum bookstore for signing. It was the 2008 Silver Medal recipient of the Council on Foreign Relations Arthur Ross Book Award. Dr. Parsi wrote his doctoral thesis on Israeli-Iranian relations under Professor Francis Fukuyama and Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS. Treacherous Alliance is the first book directly addressing Israeli-Iranian relations and their impact on U.S. national interests since 1987. It is the only book based on extensive interviews with decision makers from all three countries. Dr. Parsi has served as an adjunct professor of international relations at Johns Hopkins University, SAIS, and his articles on Middle East affairs have been published in the Financial Times, the International Herald Tribune, Christian Science Monitor, Jane's Intelligence Review, The Nation, The Wall Street Journal, The American Conservative, The Jerusalem Post, and The Forward, to name a few. He is a frequent commentator on Middle Eastern affairs and has appeared on BBC World News, PBS NewsHour, CNN, Al Jazeera, C-SPAN, NPR, MSNBC, and Democracy Now! He has served as an advisor to a U.S. congressman on Middle East issues and is the co-founder and current president of the National Iranian American Council, a non-partisan, non-profit organization promoting Iranian-American participation in American civic life. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Trita Parsi.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a great pleasure being here. It's particularly fun because I'm usually the pessimist in the room, and Bob, you beat me to it. I mean, I can't top you on that one. I'm going to present a slightly different perspective. I actually tended to agree quite a lot with what Bob was saying, but I think towards the end we may differ a little bit. I wrote the book on Iran and Israel because it was really interesting studying that subject to see that the conflict that exists between Iran and Israel, and I think was very accurately described by Bob as well, is truly a strategic one. It is about who is running the show in the Middle East. Now, both countries, both the Iranians and the Israelis, have seen it as being in their interest to portray this issue as an ideological battle. To portray this from the Israeli perspective as the battle of one Western democracy, the sole Western democracy in the region against a tyrannical, fanatical Islamic theocracy. And from the Iranian perspective, they have been fighting the Israelis off and on because of their own power ambitions, but they are describing their struggle as an Islamic struggle. They're describing it as if it is for the honor of the Palestinians and the Palestinian cause, because they know very well that if they were describing it for exactly what it is, Iranian nationalism and Iranian ambitions, that has absolutely no appeal in a larger Muslim world, in which Iran is the only Iranian state and the rest of the states are Arab. But in order to be able to make that cause attractive to the Arabs and to the Muslim states, then you have to describe it in a completely different manner. So in that strange way, both the Iranians and the Israelis both have a common interest in describing this as an ideological battle, whereas in reality it is actually purely strategic. However, when it comes to whether there is still a risk of a war between these two countries or between the United States and Iran, I perhaps would have a conflicting prediction. I would say that in the short term, there actually is a reduction of that risk. And the reason for this is that there is a shift, not only here in the United States, but I think we are starting to see a little bit of a shift in Israel as well. Let me go back in history a little bit. Since the end of the Cold War, when Iran and Israel were thrown into a strategic rivalry in the Middle East, the Israelis have been extremely active in seeking Iran's isolation and containment. They had been lobbying Washington not to talk to Iran, not to pursue any diplomacy, to impose sanctions, and on every front confront Iranian influence. As a parenthesis, it's kind of interesting because only a couple of years earlier, in spite of the Islamic Republic and in spite of the fact that Khomeini was still alive, the Iranians and the Israelis actually worked close together on a lot of different issues because they shared common threats. But after 1991 to 93, that all changed. The Israeli Plan A, essentially, has been to sound the alarm bells, to speak very highly and aggressively about the Iranian threat with the hope of achieving two things. On the one hand, prevent any dialogue or diplomacy between Iran and the United States out of a fear that if the US and the Iranians were to talk to each other, they would reach an agreement in which the United States, in essence, would accept that Iran is a major power in the region. And the deal would come at Israel's strategic interest. It would be good for the US, very good for Iran, but not so good for the Israelis. Secondly, emphasize Iran's threat to the region or to the civilization, as sometimes it sounded, in order to make sure that the American military option is always on the table. When the Israelis have been talking about their military option, the primary purpose has been not to exercise their military option, which actually isn't a very good one, but rather to make sure that the American military option is still on the table. It's actually been almost a threat against the United States. That if the US doesn't act militarily against Iran, then Israel will, and Israel will not be able to do a very good job, and a mess will fall into America's lap. So as a result, it's actually better if the US does it itself from the very beginning. That has been the argument up until about 6 months ago. Admiral Mullen went to Israel. He was there for a couple of days, met with most of the Israeli officials, and made it very clear that if Israel were to attack Iran, it would drag the United States into a third war in the Middle East at a time when it's facing significant difficulties in the first two wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, and America simply cannot afford to do so. When coming back to the United States and being asked by American journalists about the Israeli military option, his answer was, America cannot afford a third front. It would put too much strain on our troops, he said. It was a very clear signal, both to the Israelis and to the American public, that if there would be a third war, it would be a war started by the Israelis against America's wishes. The Israelis got the message. They knew that there would be a new president who would be inheriting, if the Israelis attacked, not only a disaster in Iraq, but also an even larger disaster in Iran. And it would set off Israeli-American relations in a very, very negative direction. Beyond that, the Israelis never really had much of an attractive military option to begin with. Even in the best case scenario, from their perspective, if they were to attack Iran's military facilities, some of them which they probably cannot fully reach, most of them which they cannot take out with one attack, they would have to come back. But let's say in the best case scenario from their perspective, they actually did manage to destroy those facilities. The problem is that the knowledge about nuclear enrichment does not sit in those buildings. It sits in approximately 6,000 Iranian scientists. If you want to destroy Iran's ability to enrich uranium, you have to kill those 6,000 scientists. Otherwise, the only thing you're doing in the best case scenario is that you're delaying the program a couple of years maximum. And I've had many conversations with Israelis about this, playing out all the different scenarios. And the end result is, the best case scenario, you would perhaps be able to push it back 4 to 5 years, but after that, you can be pretty damn sure the Iranians would have a nuclear weapon. Because even though right now there doesn't seem to be any convincing evidence that there is a weaponization program that is currently in place, after an attack, that weaponization program most likely will be put into place very quickly. And then the Iranians will move towards a nuclear weapon. The Israeli response is, yes, but during those 4 years, you would actually be able to have a regime change in Iran. That's a syndrome that I've seen in the military planning, in which we are very, very optimistic about the repercussions of military action, and then very skeptical about the repercussions of diplomacy. To expect that after an attack, chances of a regime change would increase flies completely in the face of our experience and our historical evidence of what happens in these countries when they are under attack. Essentially, that leaves Israel with very few options. And if the United States is not in a position to be able to take on Iran militarily because of the other difficulties faced in Iraq, then Israel essentially has lost its plan A, the idea of speaking loudly, sounding the alarm bells. And now I think we're seeing the first small signs of a very careful shift towards a plan B. A plan B that would essentially would be to align yourself with the future American policy on Iran, which the Israelis predict likely will be diplomacy, and then make sure that your interests are represented within that diplomacy to the extent possible. We've seen how Olmert, in an interview 2 weeks ago, on his way out of office, gave some very, very surprising comments about Israel's security policy as a whole. Amongst other things, he mentioned that he does not believe that Israel will be able to achieve peace in the region with its Arab neighbors unless it gives up most, if not all, Palestinian land. You don't hear Israeli prime ministers say things of this nature. On Iran, he completely dismissed the idea that Israel would take military action if the US doesn't, by saying we have to find our sense of proportions. Israel does not have the proportions to take on Iran. His exact words was that whatever we can do with the Palestinians, the Syrians, and the Lebanese, we cannot do to the Iranians. Israel had essentially, because of its emphasis on Plan A, painted itself in a corner, in which he had created the expectations that if the US doesn't attack, Israel would have to attack. Coming to the realization that America is not about to attack, Israel has to now walk away. And in my personal view, it's actually a very good development. I believe that Israel's security vis-a-vis Iran is best achieved through a US-Iran diplomacy. The expectation that the United States and Iran would make friends without having a demand that Iran has to change its posture on Israel, I think is highly unrealistic. In fact, the Iranians seem to have realized that they cannot improve their relationship with the US unless they also changed their position and their posture towards the Israeli state. One piece of supporting evidence of that theory is the proposal that the Iranians sent to the United States in 2003, May of that year. About 2 weeks after Baghdad fell, the Iranians sent a comprehensive negotiation proposal to the White House, offering broad-based negotiations. If those negotiations had been pursued within their context, the Iranians would have agreed to end all support to Hamas and Islamic Jihad and pressure them to cease using violence against Israel. Open up the nuclear file for full transparency. Support the United States in stabilizing Iraq and making sure that the government there would not be a sectarian one. Disarm Hezbollah and turning it into a mere political organization. Cooperate against all terrorist organizations, above all Al-Qaeda. And perhaps most surprisingly, sign on to the Beirut Declaration, the Saudi peace plan, the idea that the entire Arab world would recognize Israel in return for an Israeli recognition of a Palestinian state. This proposal came into the United States, to the White House, May 2003. I was in Congress at the time. It got no response. In fact, the White House's response was to reprimand the Swiss ambassador who delivered the proposal in the first place. The Swiss ambassador to Tehran has been tasked by the US government to be the official go-between between the US and the Iranians. Whenever they send official communications to each other, they go through the Swiss. The Swiss ambassador got reprimanded for having delivered the proposal in the first place. And it seems like the reason for that was that at the time there was a debate in the White House in which the neoconservatives were arguing that whatever the United States could achieve by negotiating with Iran, it could achieve even more by simply removing the government there. This is back in the days when regime change was a very fancy and favorable word in Washington vocabulary. Now, I think this is important, going back to what I mentioned earlier on about this not being an ideological battle, because it shows that there are ways of resolving this strategically, precisely because it is a strategic battle. Ideological battles don't have solutions. They have one victor, and everyone else is defeated. Strategic conflicts do not. You can find common solutions. And this is important because right now, you do have people on the far right, both in Israel and in the United States, that are saying that it's 1938 and Iran is Germany. And then they go on to imply that Ahmadinejad is Hitler. If we accept the premise of that analogy, that indeed it is 1938 and Iran is Germany, then the question is, which leader in his or her right mind would like to play the role of Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister who thought he could negotiate? This is an analogy that is deliberately devised to eliminate diplomacy from the table. And when you eliminate diplomacy from the table, you make war inevitable. But war isn't inevitable. I would say that instead of saying that it's 1938, it's 1914. We have completely discarded diplomacy. We have abdicated statecraft to military strategy, and a single bullet is enough to spark a major war. And on that happy note, I thank you.
So, Trita, the peace offer that came from the Iranians via the Swiss, for context, that happened in May at the time of mission accomplished, when the Iranians were quite afraid that they'd be the next to fall, and that Dick Cheney essentially gave them the back of the hand and said, we don't talk to evil. Now that clearly, as Bob's made it clear, we have blown it so badly, particularly in Iraq, where we're completely tied down with no end in sight, in spite of the much advertised surge. We don't talk about whether we've won the war, we've won the surge. So is there a chance of making an overall deal? That deal that they offered back then, when we had maximum leverage and we gave them the back of the hand, we obviously are coming hat in hand at this point, but give us a sense of whether this deal can be revived.
Thank you. Well, first of all, it is true that this is at a time when the United States was in a much, much better position than it is today. And the Iranians certainly were extremely worried. They had seen not only the United States take over Afghanistan, but in 3 short weeks, Iraq was defeated, a task that the Iranians had failed to achieve in 8 long years. So certainly, there was a lot of fear. But I would be hesitant to draw the conclusion that it is only because of fear that the Iranians gave the proposal. They also asked for a lot of things in return. They asked for an end to all economic sanctions, access to holy sites in Iraq, recognition of Iran's sphere of influence, of its what they called legitimate security needs. By the way, the entire proposal, the documents, its different versions are in the back of the book in the appendix. Some of the things that the Iranians at that time offered and demanded, they had actually discussed earlier on as well, when they were not in that bad of a situation. I've seen some conversations that did take place between members of Congress and Iranian diplomats before the Iraq War, in which very similar things, a very similar framework was presented. So I'm personally not convinced that the only way you can get them to make a deal is to make sure that you have their back against the wall and they're really weak. But the second part of your question, I think, is very important. We are definitely not in the same position as we were before, and as a result, it may be very, very difficult to be able to get back to that type of situation. And that says something about the cost of not pursuing diplomacy. We're oftentimes hearing people saying, oh, diplomacy is so costly, you know, we waste time, etc., etc. Well, this is the cost of not pursuing diplomacy. The Iranians had less than 100 centrifuges at the time. They have more than 4,000 now. That's the cost of not pursuing diplomacy. And it's not as if us not talking to the Iranians did the slightest thing to help the human rights situation in Iran, to do the slightest thing to help the cause of democracy in Iran. On the contrary, it's been completely counterproductive in that aspect as well. I would probably differ a little bit with Bob, though, in the sense that I don't view Iran as being that superpower. I think Iran has tremendous amount of spoiler power. It can be tremendously disruptive and problematic in the region. But I don't see Iran being in a position, economically or militarily, to take on the position of a hegemon or a superpower that would be in control. And I'm not a military expert, and Bob may know much more about this, but the type of capabilities that Iran has developed over the years, and as Bob said, been quite effective at, have been far more defensive and useful for deterrence or for spoiler in order to sabotage American policy than to actually be able to lead the region. But I'm sure we can have a good conversation about that.
So in other words, could the U.S. take him on head on? You're saying that they've perfected asymmetrical warfare.
Oh, I think we could very quickly march to Tehran. I was in Baghdad during the war, and what you noticed, the Iranian diplomats were out looking at this remarkable phenomenon. All the Iraqi tanks had little holes in the top of them from Hellfire missiles. And it was clear to the Iranians, well, if we have any tanks in the open, they're gone. So they've shifted the whole nature of warfare when, and Trita's absolutely right, it's more to thwart American power and win wars by attrition. Very easily in Iraq, they could take Hezbollah, and there are a lot of Hezbollah people there, and subject us to the same sort of resistance in Iraq. If they chose to, they're not doing it right now, which would cause us to add a couple 100,000 more troops and ultimately lose.
Quicker.
Well, I would hope it'd be quicker. Well, you just couldn't win. You'd hope it'd be quickly we'd lose, so we'd come home. But Americans just cannot sustain a warfare like Israel put up with in Lebanon, so that they've equaled out this thing. And if you marched into Tehran, what would you have? You wouldn't have a welcome there. I mean, the Iranians are, when I went to Iran, they asked me, did I have the new Jay-Z song and then going on, and they knew more about American music than I did, and they probably speak English better than I do. But that doesn't mean that they accept our politics, our national security. I mean, they do remember Mossadegh coup. It was a humiliation. They don't like the CIA, and yet they're sophisticated enough for Ahmadinejad to host me. I mean, I got off at Tehran airport, and they pulled me aside to fingerprint me, and this lady's just apologizing profusely, saying, well, you do it to us, and it's diplomatic reciprocity. American journalists need to get. And I thought, oh my God, I really am the Mr. Magoo of the CIA, and they're going to haul me off, never to be heard of again. But they were absolutely polite. The police never bothered us. They knew that basically harmless. So there's all the CIA propaganda is just that. It's a very sophisticated culture that we're dealing with. And also, they only have a couple wars to deal with. And we are thinking about Georgia and Venezuela and the rest of it. And, Washington has the attention span of a gnat, So Iran doesn't. And this is how they can equalize the power.
So when you say, as you do in your new book, that the Iranians both want to humble us and work with us, you detect a schizophrenia there.
No, not at all. I mean, they said, look, we can put 1 million soldiers in uniform very quickly. Saudi Arabia doesn't have an army. Kuwait doesn't have one. Qatar's the size of a large hotel. Why are you paying any attention to the Arabs? And the Pakistanis, I mean, I just adopted a child in Pakistan, so I spent the last 6 months there, are going under. And the Iranians are saying very logically, give us our due, because we are the guys you want to ally with. But we're not going to be, imposed in preconditions or talked down to or put on the axis of evil. Or if you want to bring up old history, talk about shooting down the Airbus. I mean, they have an argument for everything on and then going back to Mossadegh. We can go on the morality of this conflict forever and about terrorism. And they will look at Lebanon, and they've now come out, and the ambassador at the time to Syria has acknowledged that Iran was behind the Islamic Jihad. And what they're saying, they're defining this not as terrorism, but as a military conflict, and they happen to use martyrs and the rest of it. So we're really missing on the language. And Trita's absolutely right, this whole ideology about Israel. What I would like to see is somebody smart in Israel go secretly to Tehran, make the outlines of an agreement, and present it to Obama or McCain or whoever gets in, and say it's a done deal, just like Oslo. I mean, that's the good news. That's the best thing that can happen. Because the Israelis, you're right, the treaty, they cannot do anything with Iran. Iran's ever going to be there forever. And they will not forget even a precision bombing of their nuclear facilities. They'll never forget it.
So what was happening there last week in Tehran with Khatami hosting a bunch of Kofi Annan and Mary Robinson, and you get the feeling that maybe Ahmadinejad has embarrassed them too much, and they want to tack back a little bit towards the West.
Let me make 2 points on the previous questions first. I would want to add one more, a psychological factor, because I think you mentioned something very important, Bob, that the Israelis are not going to be able to do it. But one psychological factor that would make them very hesitant to do it is that as long as there's been these fights between the Israelis and the Iranians, they have always fought each other through proxies. They've been very careful not to get into a direct confrontation with each other without those proxies. And Iran is still a country that hosts more Jews than any other country in the Middle East except Israel itself. The Iranian Jewish community stretches back 2,500 years. Many of the most high-ranking Israeli officials are also of Iranian descent, some of them born in Iran. So there's also this psychological factor in which both Iran and Israel view each other as non-Arab states in a sea of Arabs. They're currently at odds because they're the two most powerful countries in the region. But it's smarter to fight through proxies than to do it directly, because when you fight countries directly, particularly in the Middle East, no one forgets. And that can come back and haunt you. So that one more reason why I think much of the Israeli bluster has been exactly that, bluster. They're not prepared to go into that direct confrontation. And also, I think you said something extremely important, Bob. You mentioned that they can do these things to the United States because we have so many other conflicts to take care of. We're responsible for Iraq. All of these things show that the responsibility and the weight of being the hegemon and the asymmetric benefit of not being the hegemon. If the Iranians were actually, if the United States completely withdrew, and the Iranians were then left with the responsibility for the region, they would be in an extremely difficult position. And that creates a symbiosis between the United States and Iran. I think the US by now should probably have come to the conclusion we cannot have stability in any region if we want to base that stability on the exclusion of some of the most powerful states of that region. It just doesn't work. Whether we like those countries or not, it just does not work. And in Iran, it certainly has not worked. It's one of the most powerful countries in the region. We have tried to create an order there based on their exclusion, and it has failed miserably. It could only work as long as we pumped money and blood into it, and it's not worth it. It cannot stand on its own legs. But the Iranians also have to come to the conclusion that whether they like it or not, whether we have a financial crisis or not, the United States is the sole superpower of the world. You should be very careful about wishing that power away, because you're not powerful enough to take on the responsibilities that it's currently shouldering. Now, as to your question on Khatami, it seems like everyone in Iran are gearing up for what's probably going to be a very interesting election. I don't want to necessarily call it a democratic election. There's a tremendous amount of flaws with the system over there, very undemocratic elements there. But within the small circle of people that are permitted to participate and run and stand for a public election, there is very intense competition. And right now, the rumors are in Tehran that if McCain wins, then Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, is going to continue to give support to Ahmadinejad and try to make sure that he wins re-election in June of next year. Because the Iranian conclusion is when you have a, how shall we put it, somewhat less than stable person in the White House, then you want to have someone less than stable to be your face as well, to show a very tough face. You guys are not taping this, I hope, right? If Obama wins, however, then the Iranians would probably commit a major mistake if there was an overture by the Obama administration and they committed the same mistake Bush did when he rejected any offer. And there must be a recognition by now, I believe, in Tehran, at least in some of the higher circles there, that Ahmadinejad is a political obstacle to any political understanding between the two countries because of the rhetoric that he's used, etc. And if Obama wins, there's going to probably be a lot of pressure, both from other conservatives as well as the reformists, for Khamenei to essentially not play a role in the elections, as he did last time, in which he heavily supported Ahmadinejad and was probably responsible for making sure that he won. So it's going to be terribly, terribly interesting, and it essentially means that when you all go and vote, and I hope you all will go and vote, the entire fate of this planet rests on your shoulders.
So, Bob, since you've been up against the IRGC and they killed your boss and killed all your colleagues, and I mean, to what extent, obviously, Ahmadinejad comes out of that group. Are they really the power behind the scene? Or, I mean, we hear that they're all different power centers. There's a very opaque budgetary situation there. It's hard to figure out who's in charge, except nominally the supreme leader.
Well, the IRGC is, I mean, you know, when I went to the embassy 2 years ago and knocked on the door, and the IRGC still occupies it.
The American embassy
in
in
American
Tehran.
embassy in Tehran, and I said, could I come in and look around? And they said, go away. And I said, but I'm an American taxpayer. they didn't even get I didn't even get a smile at all, and they just slammed the gate closed. That didn't work. Anyhow, but they do coordinate with Khamenei, the supreme leader. I mean, they are not an undisciplined group. They are an arm of the state of Iran. They are very disciplined. They're very capable. They have the ability, you know, again, go back to this 2006 war. They had the ability to grab Americans in Beirut, but the order came down saying, we don't care what side the Americans take on this conflict in Lebanon. Do not touch an American, and no one did. Now, don't ever ask, the various Sunni groups to do that. I mean, they're just, the Sunnis are the anarchists. If you if you can, exaggerate it. So they have a parallel nuclear program, which we don't know about. It's impossible to get into. And they're extraordinarily sophisticated in staying off cell phones. You wouldn't find anybody from the Pasdaran on a cell phone. You wouldn't see, every once in a while, these guys come out to the west. There's a guy, he lives in Los Angeles, in fact, that I think it was Rezai's son or one of them, that just said incredible things. Everybody ignored him, but he was absolutely right. But it's not something we should worry about as a rogue organization that's going to start a war, because they could have done it in the Gulf a long time ago. But on the other hand, if we do take out their communication system, they will be able to act independently to retaliate very quickly. I mean, you can take out the leadership, you can knock their communications off the air, and they can retaliate in the Gulf.
So, just in terms of the idea of less theocracy, more democracy, is that a pipe dream?
In Iran or in the U.S.?
Touche.
You have to be specific.
Well, I guess with the President Palin, you would have an incipient theocracy. I have to admit, you'd have a pretty know nothing kind of theocracy. But let's assume that that doesn't happen. Now in Iran,
I think in the long run, I perhaps I'm naively optimistic. I just see it as impossible for Iran not to become a full democracy. I just don't see it being feasible. Now, it doesn't mean that everything is necessarily going in the right direction at all. In fact, I would say that the Iranian government is tremendously, tremendously unpopular for many reasons. We may think it's solely because of the lack of social freedoms and veiling the women, etc., but it's because of how the society there is now. Drug abuse is huge, corruption, economic mismanagement. They're seeing how many of their Arab neighbors to the south are making tremendous economic progress, etc. These things are obviously causing the people there to be extremely negative towards their own government. The conclusion that, unfortunately, I think we often draw here I'm not in Washington now, but usually in Washington, is that precisely because of this undeniable unpopularity of the government, that means that the country is ripe for revolution. I don't see any evidence for that, and part of the reason for that is that the Iranian people already did a revolution 30 years ago. It didn't end up exactly as they had hoped for. Let's just put it that way. Because when you do revolutions, you know who you are revolting against. You have a far less of an idea who you are revolting for. And right now, they don't see clear democratic options out there that would make it possible and feasible for them to take the risk of going out on the street and do whatever you have to do to change the government. Let me give you an example. I was interviewing a lady in one of the ministries, and like a lot of technocrats in Iran, mid-level in the ministries, they're very negative about the government. The joke is that in Iran, everyone dislikes the government, including the government. But at the same time, she expressed a lot of hesitation and fear that there would be a sudden change of government, particularly that it would be some wannabe Chalabi groups coming in from the US, because she had no confidence in them being democratic. And as a result, she was fearful that those groups would identify her as part of the government, because at the end of the day, she worked in a ministry, even though she was herself against the government. And when you don't have confidence in the group's democratic credentials, that means that if you are defined as part of the government, you may be executed on the spot. In the Iranian Revolution, it was instant justice. People were killing off people to the left and right and taking revenge. No one is looking forward to that. And no one is looking forward to a situation, as you mentioned in your opening, of Iraq. So unfortunately, as tensions have risen, as we have failed to do this democratic, if it ever was meant to be this democratic experiment in Iraq, more and more, the question is not between democracy and tyranny. It's been reduced to stability and instability. And as a result, people everywhere choose stability over instability, even though they heavily dislike their own government.
Any thoughts, Bob? We're going to open up for questions.
Well, this is a fantasy, a neocon fantasy. We can overthrow the government in Iran. Forget it. I mean, I used to overthrow governments for profession, or try to. It's not doable. I used to ran the Iranian opposition for many years. Nice bunch of people, academics, and the rest of it. It was useless. I mean, and I think that even if we did overthrow this group of people, the religious parties only get 10% of the vote, the Majlis, plus or minus. You're still left with Iran, a very nationalistic country that's not going to want to give up its gains in Iraq, Lebanon, and the rest of it, and it is still going to have the Palestinian cause. This is not the Palestinian cause. It's not an invention of the mullahs. It's been around forever. It goes back to the Muslim Brotherhood. It goes back to the 20s. You're going to have still the same Iran, the same state, and we just have to learn how to deal with it. And I argue that we're almost better with Iran. I spent 2 years in Israeli prisons talking to Hamas suicide bombers, and they could not articulate what they wanted to do against Israel. It came down to do to the enemy as they do to us, and that's as far as it went. Now, when I talked to the family of the boy who blew up the Israeli headquarters in Tyre in November 1982, they were very specific. They said that was a military target, and it stopped there. I mean, there was a coherence to the Iranians in this war, and as Trita says, and I couldn't agree more, if it's a strategic empire and not an ideological one, there is room to negotiate. And if Pakistan goes under, and Iraq in a certain sense, we're going to want the Iranians. We're going to say we got to do something. And then again, for Saudi Arabia, I mean, let's don't ever forget the facts that there were 15 Saudis on those planes on 9/11 and not 15 Iranians. The Iranians wouldn't have think, yeah. Or Iraqis, or they just wouldn't have thought it. I mean, we have to start, if we're going to fight an empire, our empire, what's left of it in the Middle East, we better get to know the difference between a Shia and a Sunni. I mean, McCain doesn't know, but it's the first thing he's got to learn. There is a difference.
So we have microphones on both sides. This gentleman down here in the front, the dark suit.
Thank you, Ian. My question is to both speakers. Assuming that there was a capacity for militarily decimating Iran and then marching in and, begging the Iranians begging for mercy, executing a regime change. Just within the first shot, either by Israel, by the U.S., or both, what can the West collectively expect potentially in retaliation from Russia, China, Pakistan, and Venezuela due to either alliances with Iran or just due to the shift in geopolitical reality?
Well, it's my hobby horse is oil. If you don't mind me answering, the Russians would love it. I mean, they export 5 million barrels of oil a day. If it goes to $250 a barrel, and they'd say, look at the Americans. Of course, you can't trust them. There are 3 wars in the Middle East. They would just let things slide. I think what we'd really be concerned about is again, Hezbollah, because they've trebled the size of their rocket force, and the Israelis would have to go into Syria and Lebanon to take these rockets out, and that would start to look very much like World War III. So we would see, and you'd see a reaction in the West Bank and Hamas. You would see what the Iranians would hope at that point is, after an attack, that you would see the Palestinians, for instance, in Jordan, which are more than 50% of the population, would come to the aid of Hezbollah in Iran. And this happened in 1967, where there was a hope that in that war that the Arabs would rise. I think we have a much larger chance there'd be a wide reaction, an attack on Iran.
Due to the blocked oil and natural gas from the
And because we'd have to react. We'd have to go in. We'd have to go into the northern side of the Persian Gulf and take out those missiles physically. I mean, you have to send teams in. You'd have to bomb Iran, and you simply can't go in and kill 5 million Iranians in the major cities, where the Pasdaran is based in many cases, or the Basij, and not have a huge reaction. It's just it's a bridge too far.
Where's our microphone on that side? The gentleman up there in the back to your right there. Yeah.
It seems to me that Iran is in a strong position just by the nature of who they are, how long they've been there, and their relationship with Muqtada al-Sadr in Iraq. And Israel has all their nuclear weapons. So maybe those are the main players in this movie. You know, maybe the U.S. needs to just kind of back down and negotiate between the players more instead of trying to be a main actor itself.
I could just say one thing. I mean, this administration pushed the Israelis into the 2006 war. They said, "Go at it, take these guys out, and we'll go after Iran." I mean, you know, I keep on saying this. We are always ready to fight. You know, the neocons are always ready to fight the Arabs to the last Israeli, and now we are sort of responsible to act maturely, and we're not. You're absolutely right. We just got to show. You've got to talk to the Iranians to ask them to figure out what they want and give them a step-by-step plan for deconflicting the problem, the tension in the Persian Gulf and Iraq. And they really are a lot more rational than they were in '79. I mean, that's a good story. I mean, it's a mature revolution. It happens. It happens the French Revolution. It happened to even Gaddafi. I mean, supposedly he blew up an American airplane, and we're reopening an embassy and doing big oil deals. I mean, why can't we do the same with Iran?
This side. The lady on the aisle there.
Considering the Sunni-Shia divide, would there be any Sunni objections to U.S.-Iranian diplomacy continuing forward?
Yes.
Would it be mass suicide?
What you have in the region is not just the Israelis who have been concerned what the implications of a U.S.-Iran diplomacy would be. It's also the other powerful countries, particularly Saudi Arabia. We've created a very artificial situation in which a giant in the region is not permitted to come into the room and does not have a seat at the table. And some countries have grown accustomed to that, and they think it's a permanent, sustainable situation. It's not. But it means that once the giant comes in and takes a seat at the table, everyone else's seat is going to become a little bit smaller. And this is a problem for them. And I think it's an even greater problem for them. We are fueling the sense of danger that they're seeing in this by us not coordinating things with our allies. There's a fear in these countries that the U.S. will just rush in and make a peace deal with the Iranians, and Iran will be the new ally in the region, and they will forget about everyone else. And they're left with that impression because we're not coordinating. We're not asking them what their thoughts are. We're not doing any alliance management in the way that we should be doing. One Arab official joked about it and told me, he said that Iran and the United States are like two big elephants, and the Arabs are the grass. Whether the elephants make war or make love, the grass still gets crushed. That's their perspective. On the one hand, they're fearful of war because war would be bad for them as well, but they're perhaps even more fearful of diplomacy. We need to resolve that. So going back to the earlier question, I don't think us just leaving and discarding our involvement from the Middle East is actually a solution. It will create a major vacuum. It will only create more problems. We've seen what the decline of American power does. It opens up opportunities for conflicts that otherwise have been put under the lid. Georgia is one example. Same thing would happen in the Middle East. Rather than looking at our mistakes and thinking, hell with it, let's just leave, we actually have to take responsibility and pursue good policies there and show some leadership, but make sure that we're not the hegemon in the sense that we're calling all the shots and it's just our way or the highway. That's not going to work. That's going to backfire, and it so far obviously has.
At the back there.
I can understand why the Iranian government wants to be involved in the Israeli-Palestinian struggle and in Lebanon because it's a way to extend their influence. But how much do the Iranian people care? They're not Arabs. They don't speak Arabic. They're a long way away from the region. They've got their own economic problems. Is it a factor for the people or just the government?
We could both answer. I think there's a sense of fairness in the Middle East because you have to look at Israel as, for most, on a very popular level, is looked at as an extension of the United States. It's not looked as an independent country. I mean, everybody's been to Israel and will know the Israelis look like thin Americans. And so this is the way they look at it. I mean, they look at it. I mean, where did Israel come from? You know, and there's a certain. I mean, Iran is a very old, sophisticated civilization. I mean, if you know Iranians well, they'll talk about the things that went on thousands of years ago when we were still living in caves. And so there's a certain feeling of humiliation. Now, I've found in my years, and the Arabs don't really like the Palestinians very much. They like the Lebanese, they like the Egyptians. They're not a particularly popular people. And the Iranians have said over and again privately, we have to do something for the Palestinians, but it's whatever the Palestinians accept. And so this idea that they have to push Israel into the ocean is not generally accepted, even in Hezbollah. They'll sit down and say, we don't really care about that. We want them out of Lebanon, actually. But, so if Olmert says 242, part of Jerusalem, the West Bank and Gaza, I mean, this is a huge development for a conservative prime minister to raise this coming out of office or still in office. The Iranians are going to go along with it. I mean, they are a nationalistic power that wants their due.
I would agree. I would just add that a sense of justness of the Palestinian cause, you definitely hear amongst ordinary Iranians, but they make a differentiation in the sense that, yes, what's going on over there is very unjust. The Palestinian rights need to be restored, but it's not our problem. It's not our money or our blood that should be spent on it. And this is part of the problem that, for instance, during the Lebanese war, there was a tremendous amount of anger in Iran because there were rumors that Iran was sending hundreds of millions of dollars to Hezbollah to do the restoration immediately after the war. And people were saying, look, this money needs to be spent back here. It was one of the first times that I noticed that the Iranian leadership was going on TV and explaining the conflict in very clear geopolitical terms, explaining to the Iranian people why they still needed to do this. And their explanation, to just simplify, was that this was not a war between Israel and Lebanon. This was a precursor towards a war against Iran, and Iran is much better off fighting it, having the front lines being as far away from Iran as possible. And you usually did not hear the Iranian leadership explain conflicts in those terms. They instead put it in the garment of Islam, and this is a pride of Islam, and et cetera, and try to get away with it that way. They couldn't. They had to put it in nationalistic terms in order to make sure that they could quell the anger that existed.
Are you saying Israel is a threat to Iran?
Am I saying that? No, I don't think that's what I said. But that wasn't the question.
Okay, this side, the gentleman in the middle here with his hand up. No, there. Sorry.
Thank you. I was wondering what you thought of Weapons Inspector Scott Ritter, his comment that if Israel or America struck Iran in an attack on their nuclear facilities, that you could kiss an American city goodbye or something to that effect.
Oh, there's no evidence of that. I mean, that you hear this, Detroit, there's Hezbollah cells, and look, we lost 15 tons of explosives. We're coming out of Lebanon. I don't know where they are. You could, but it's this fear that they're everywhere and they're going to come out of Canada, and they're in the tri-border region in South America. They've gone beyond this. They really have. they feel that they can take us on in the Middle East, and they really don't need it. And this guy Mugnia, this is my nemesis all these years. I so badly wanted an interview with him. Won't get it. The guy was killed in Damascus. He was in retirement. He was training Palestinians. It's an irrational fear that people are playing off. And this, again, it goes back since 9/11. This administration has just been playing off fear, just raw fear, to deceive and lie, and that's what they're doing. I mean, the chances of bin Laden being dead are very high. The question is, are they going to drag him out in the next 2 weeks? As Ian and I will be talking about at cold storage, and say we finally got him. People don't. I don't know that he's dead, but he probably is. Well, let's put it this way. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind, said he wasn't working for bin Laden. So,
Can you wait on the microphone, please, sir? Can you wait on the microphone, please?
yeah, no, he's talking about the famous white van. It's an intriguing story. It deserves a book.
Okay, the gentleman behind you there.
My question is, I hear all of this, and I don't think we went to Iraq because of Iran. I think it was the result of 9/11 and Osama bin Laden, Al Qaeda, and how do they fit into the equation? The goal of Al Qaeda and bin Laden wasn't to just bring down 2 high-rises. It was the economic ramification, and I think if you look at it like that, I think he won that one. We are in the economic situation that we are at right now.
It was we pumped liquidity in the markets after 9/11, and everybody bought houses and went shopping. Yeah, I mean, people laugh about bin Laden being a CIA agent. I'm beginning to wonder, bringing down his own country. It was just. It was so bizarre going into Iraq, and I've said this over and over again. I used to run Iraqi operations. We had no information about Saddam's weapons of mass destruction going into that war. It was just completely bottom dragging, cherry picking, whatever you want to call. I think that it was an act of folly, not intention, because we don't know how much oil there is in Iraq. And Wolfowitz and Feith and the people that brought us this war didn't either. I think, let's be fair. I think they probably really thought that they could change the Middle East by bringing democracy to Iraq. I mean, we have to give them the benefit of the doubt. I mean, Wolfowitz and the rest of them haven't made any money off of this. If they'd been running hedge funds and made fortunes off of this, I'd say there's the evidence. But the problem is in Washington, and Trita know this, you're in a bubble. We're in a bubble. We've got 2 big oceans between us and the rest of the world, and people do not understand the Middle East because, I don't know, Trita, they don't understand why. You spend more time there than I do now. I don't understand why they don't understand it.
It is, we had a conversation about this earlier on. It is, in my view, rather scary to see that if you have children, you want to make sure that they grow up and they have safe jobs with great job security, make them political analysts in Washington. Because however wrong they are, they're never going to lose their jobs. The people who brought us this war, the analysts that were cheerleading it, are still in their positions.
And they'll be in an Obama administration as much as a McCain administration.
We'll see.
So on this side, the gentleman waving his fingers there. Yeah.
I wanted to ask Mr. Baer a question. When you were here 6 months ago, Wayne White made the point that there would, in all probability, by October, be a Sunni insurrection, and I believe you concurred with that. Can you tell us what went wrong, at least with Wayne White's estimation?
I think, with Iraq, we are always on the edge of another civil war. The Sunni, what was clear was the Sunni joined the awakening, the tribal groups, before the surge started. And this is in no way to take away from what our patrols are doing there, our soldiers. I mean, it's amazing how far we've come, the learning curve on dealing with in an Arab country, and got the bad apples out and figured out how to work this. But it's mainly that the Sunni are terrified that we are going to leave. Baghdad is now close to 70% Shia. The Sunni are still not coming back. What they're afraid of is if they continue to host al-Qaeda, we get up and leave it to Iran and the Shia, which is their worst nightmare. Now, the Baquba and Diyala and the rest of them, the provinces, are still not, contained. But more than that, you've seen a phenomenon among Sunnis. Extremism, it's like Christian extremism. It pops up in history. It popped up with 9/11. There was people were shocked, furious. Even the people are anti-American, and you see the communities turning against it. I mean, what's gone on in Saudi Arabia since those first few explosions? None. Al-Qaeda is, for all intents and purposes, gone away as an armed movement in Saudi Arabia. They get disgusted with the violence. The Iraqis got disgusted with it. But the point is, for the United States, we can't pull our troops out and this government would remain in place. It would fall immediately. These guys are making, Maliki and the rest of them are making as much money as they can selling oil concessions. And this president, the ambassador, Ryan Crocker, has said, we can't leave because it all falls apart the moment we do. My question is, do we stay in Iraq for the next 50 years? At how many trillions and trillions of dollars can we afford this empire? And I don't think so. I mean, can't afford it.
This gentleman here, down here in the second row on the right.
Bob, we've spoken at length about the Kurds' role in the region. I know both of you haven't brought that up this evening, if there was a particular reason, if you just feel that they were a speed bump and not really a necessity in the process. And the second question was, I was interested in hearing the doctor's opinion about your notion of Israelis, the Iranians wanting Israel and to sort of correspond with the UN resolution and sort of pulling back to lands. I forget the year. Do you feel that that's do you feel that's a realistic possibility, or do you feel does the doctor feel that's something that Israel will not comply with?
242, 1967. Go ahead.
I was quoting Olmert in an interview that he gave recently, in which he was very critical of the Israeli security doctrine. And one can speculate and say that it's because he's very frustrated because he's forced out of office. But it was a lengthy interview in which there was a common thread through everything that he was saying. And he essentially was saying that, to simplify, that Israel has had a very difficult experience. Israel from the outset thought that once in a position of great strength, the Arabs would essentially be forced to make peace with it. Israel is, even though it suffered a major blow, it's still in a significant position of strength, probably stronger in the last couple of years than it's ever been vis-a-vis the Arabs. In 1991, the Arabs lost their superpower, and suddenly there wasn't any real military conventional threat to Israel. There was an asymmetric threat, but not a military. There was no Arab army that could invade. Yet, the conclusion has been that Israel has failed to translate that position of overwhelming power into a peace. And his conclusion, if one is to believe by word exactly what he was saying, is that it simply won't happen until most, if not all, those are his words, Palestinian territory is returned. I don't know if that will be achieved, but I do tend to agree with him that I don't see peace being possible unless that is done.
Well, with so much at stake, it seems so picayune. I don't get it. I mean, what is the reason why you can't make that deal? Because there's only a handful of nutcases living in the West Bank.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't make it that simple, Ian. You have a very powerful settlement movement in Israel. They're not in a majority. but by God, are they dedicated to their cause and in a very intense manner. It's been probably easier for them to get support from outside of Israel than it has been for the larger majority of Israelis that are more willing to go back to the Green Line. Their cause is not becoming a major fundraising cause in the U.S., for instance. And you have an entire military complex in Israel that has securitized almost every aspect of Israeli life. One Israeli analyst who actually left because of this said to me that, remember, Iran is always 2 to 5 years from a nuclear bomb, according to the Israelis. Since 1991, that has been the Israeli line. Years pass, but Iran is always 2 to 5 years away. And he said that part of the problem is that in Israel right now, if you want to make a career, describe Armageddon scenarios and worst case scenarios. Every time you're wrong, no one will remember. The one time that you're right, you become a 4-star general. And this creates a great asymmetric situation in how analysis is being produced. And in my view, it's become an imprisonment for the Israelis themselves. I strongly believe that the vast majority of them want to break out of it.
If they just traded off the Palestinian problem and make a deal with Iran, which is the emerging superpower. So given all of that promise, what are they trading off? They got a nightmare on their hands on the West Bank. Why are they holding on to it?
Well, see, the problem is the Israelis over the years have become, you know, the guy who made the wall, I went and interviewed him, and he said to me, he said, this isn't about Arabs or Muslims. I said, see that wall there that I designed? There's 400 million people, and there's going to be 800 million people who want to come here and live. He said it was an urban nightmare for him, not a political problem. You also have the problem of, again, going back to Lebanon, and Hassan Nasrallah, he is the Salahuddin, he's popular everywhere, and they don't know how far it's going to go. You have to put the rights or wrong in Israel is not the point here. It's the point is a lot of Israelis are scared. They got rocketed. You know, the chief of police in Haifa, a very close friend of mine, and kept on going about the Russian mafia. But when I called him in 2006, in the middle of this, he had changed his tune.
Mm.
Got shelled. So we're looking at it from this side of the Atlantic. They are really worried about their future, and they are casting around for ways to hold on.
Gentleman right here next to you, Claudia.
How would the rest of the Middle East respond to either a McCain administration or an Obama administration?
What I do in my vacations is I go hang out with very odd people, and in this last one I spent time with the Red Mosque people, the survivors in Islamabad, basically Qaeda related, and they were going on and on screaming about Obama is going to attack Mecca and take Mecca. I said I hadn't heard that, but what she was referring to, this is the wife of the.
They attend the Palin rally.
I mean, she sounded just like Palin. What he's talking about is Obama going into Pakistan, and this is not going to improve relations instantly. Obama, when he becomes president, it's not. And I think he's just going to have to be more. I say that if we were going to cut a deal with Iran, and I'm speaking very narrowly, McCain is the guy that could sell it, just like Nixon did with China. I mean, he's not going to, but I think he could sell it.
Well, both of you gentlemen have books up in the bookstore to be signed, and you can continue the conversation with them up in the bookstore. And I thank you both for coming. Been a very interesting discussion. I wish there was more of this discussion out there in the body politic, but of course we've got to talk about washed up 60s radicals instead. So thank you, Dr. Parsi, and thank you, Bob Baer.
Thank you.